We have now had the biggest terrorist attack on Australian soil in our history and one of the biggest gun massacres since the Port Arthur Massacre of 1996, and very much like John Howard's moves back in 1996 to ignore the calls for a coronial inquest or a royal commission, our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has decided to refuse a royal commission into the Bondi attacks. As with Port Arthur, I'm starting to see very uncomfortable indications that there is going to be, in essence, a form of cover-up, despite the outraged calls from all elements of society, be it politically, or the Jewish community, or the Australian public in general, that a royal commission is absolutely necessary and mandated to get to the bottom of the Bondi attacks.
Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised.
This episode of the Wasp Files is part 2 of part 1, which was conducted last Tuesday as a special report discussing the uncomfortable parallels between the Port Arthur Massacre of 1996 and the recent terror attacks that took place at Bondi Beach. By necessity, it was important to do a part 2 because more information has since come to light from the first attack and been made public, which then once again brings attention to the correlation between that terrorist attack and Port Arthur Massacre. So the first thing to discuss is that it has become apparent that the alleged perpetrators of that attack, one of whom has survived, which is the son, were known to ASIO, our intelligence forces. The son was under investigation for something like 6 months, was cleared in essence by ASIO and not considered to be a threat, despite the fact that he had associations with radical Islamic elements that were considered to be of interest to ASIO, our intelligence organisation.
His son Naveed first came onto the radar of ASIO back in 2019. 2021, Akram, the younger Akram, he was placed on that watch list, but again, he fell through the cracks and he fell off the surveillance radar. But the reason that he was put on that list in the first place was because of his known associations with some of these alleged radical extreme preachers in Western Sydney. He'd had influence from them.
So after the 6 months, the son was cleared, and yet the father was permitted to have a firearms licence and to purchase 6 firearms legally. And then in conjunction with his son, both of those individuals then allegedly carried out the attack at Bondi. So questions were starting to be asked about what ASIO knew and why there was no interception or intervention to continue observing both of these individuals and to certainly prevent them from being in a situation where they could procure high-powered firearms to then use against the Jewish people that had gathered on the beach at Bondi to celebrate Hanukkah. The other information that has come to light is that both of these individuals had also travelled overseas to the Philippines and undertaken training at a terrorist camp over in the Philippines using those firearms. Now, this is very disturbing and raises questions about why there was no red flag about the travel to that nation and to their activities abroad, which then enabled them to be a lot more proficient with the firearms which were employed on the day at Bondi Beach. So we've got a situation where there was some foreknowledge of these perpetrators, and the question then has to be asked, why wasn't something done by ASIO? You could then argue the 3 possibilities present themselves. The first is that they were considered not to be a threat and were put off the radar, which you would consider to be perhaps an incompetency. The second possibility is that they were under-resourced and didn't have the necessary resources to continue observation of these individuals, and so ASIO itself was suffering from a lack of resources to be able to do their job properly. The third unpleasant possibility is that they were fully aware that these individuals were now armed and potentially dangerous and trained by terrorists, and that the action was allowed to occur once again to enable an agenda to be brought in to confiscate firearms off the Australian population. The investigation that would be necessary to dig deep into the actions or inactions of ASIO would be required by something like a coronial inquest or a royal commission. So once again, an uncomfortable parallel with the Port Arthur Massacre. We have now had the biggest terrorist attack on Australian soil in our history, and one of the biggest gun massacres since the Port Arthur Massacre of 1996, and very much like John Howard's moves back in 1996 to ignore the calls for a coronial inquest or a royal commission, our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has decided to refuse a royal commission into the Bondi attacks, despite the outraged calls from all elements of society, be it politically or the Jewish community or the Australian public in general, that a royal commission is absolutely necessary and mandated to get to the bottom of the Bondi attacks.
This commission would involve public hearings and won't be run out of your department. Are you running from scrutiny by not holding one?
No.
Prime Minister,
Thank you.
Prime Minister, why is Robert Frank wrong?
The Prime Minister defiant there, not bowing to pressure to call a federal royal commission into what happened in Bondi.
So now we've got two major gun crime massacres, two of the biggest in Australian history, and both Prime Ministers had refused to enter into a royal commission to investigate those crimes. Now this is an outrage. These are major events. A coronial inquest is a separate inquest in relation to a royal commission, so I certainly think that that is warranted, and that would then rely on the machinations of the New South Wales State Coroner to implement. So we'll have to see whether that occurs. What we've also found out, of course, too, is that there has been some subsequent alleged potential terrorist activity that is based from radicalised Islamic factions. So we had an incident where 2 carloads of young Muslim men had travelled up from Melbourne, Victoria to the Bondi region and were intercepted by heavily armed tactical police. Their vehicle was rammed. They were dragged from the vehicle and cable-tied and held at gunpoint on the road by very military-looking police in camouflage uniforms with high-powered rifles. And reports were that these individuals had come on the radar of both ASIO and the police, that there was a potential for a violent, possibly terrorist-related activity to be undertaken at Bondi Junction. The decision was made to intercept these individuals prior to any kind of event occurring, so their vehicle was rammed and they were dragged out and hogtied on the road. However, these individuals were unarmed, and as a result of those actions, they were forced to be released without charge. You could argue that this was perhaps a foolish interception that was a little premature, given that these individuals were not armed. They may have been travelling to the Bondi region to gather weapons in preparation for some kind of attack, but now we'll never know because they were forced to be released. This has also opened the door to potential civil lawsuit against the authorities because these individuals are arguing that they were not there for any nefarious purposes and were targeted, racially targeted. So perhaps it was meant to be a show of force to show the community that the authorities were on the ball and going to be very heavy-handed with any potential attacks. But it was a little preemptive. And so now all it's done is made them look like they jumped the gun too early. The other outrageous aspect of the entire crime that occurred at Bondi, and this relates once again to the Port Arthur Massacre with the coverage and the responses by the government and the powers that be, is that there seems to be an aversion to address directly the cause of the threat that was apparent on the day of the Bondi attacks. The New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, had basically given a press conference and said that the government had stepped up to the challenge and that they were strengthening anti-hate laws and bringing in measures to protect anti-Semitism. And they were directing a lot of these towards what was termed to be the threat as far-right extremism. When questioned by the reporter about whether or not the threat was potentially radicalised Islamic elements, here the New South Wales Premier and Anthony Albanese refused to state that that was the threat.
And should there be a greater emphasis on hate speech from Muslim clerics in the western part of Sydney?
I think, as I said earlier, what we've done is criminalise more forms of hate speech. And we've criminalised the Nazi salute. Obviously, that's in its own context. But we need to be looking at all of this, and it is really important that we have.
So should there be a greater emphasis on this hate speech from Muslim clerics then?
Well, I don't want to. We will go through all of this. I emphasise that we have done more in terms of criminalising hate speech than we have seen from any other government. But we need to look at all of this.
Now, this is absolutely astonishing, given that at least on the surface, it appears that this was an attack that was driven by radicalised elements of Islamic belief systems against the Jewish population. It goes hand in hand with the general rise in anti-Semitism that has been apparent in New South Wales and across Australia, with some of the protests where protesters were calling for gassing of the Jews, where synagogues were being firebombed, and there was very clear indications that there was a rise in anti-Jewish sentiment following the conflict that occurred on the October 7th attacks in Israel and also the subsequent Gaza conflict. So the warnings apparently were there, but somehow or other the threat of radicalised Islamic terrorism doesn't seem to be on the forefront with the government's agenda to tackle the extreme violence that is leading to these kind of attacks. Just the other day, we've also had a rabbi's vehicle in Melbourne firebombed. That vehicle was hoisting a sign that said Happy Hanukkah, and that was firebombed as well. So there seems to be very clear indications that we are far from free of the possibility of further religiously based attacks, and yet the government is refusing to acknowledge that. This also carries on to the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, who astoundingly made a statement that the attack at the Bondi Beach was not a religiously based attack. And you just have to shake your heads and say, if it wasn't that, what was it? So, it's very clear that it seems to be that there are alternate voices that are controlling what I would consider to be the puppets in our authorities, basically saying, look, you're allowed to say this, but you can't say that. It seems very clear to everyone the nature of this attack, that it is in fact an Islamic-based terrorist attack. The Bondi Beach attackers were hoisting a black ISIS flag in their vehicle, that was found in their vehicle. They were also apparently tossing homemade explosives out, which very fortuitously did not detonate amongst the crowd, and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, were found in these vehicles. This is a very clear indication that this isn't just some lone wolf criminal attack. And yet our government is doing everything they can to divert attention away from their own failings in relation to the problems with unvetted mass immigration that have led undesirable terrorist elements into our country. So Port Arthur, which is pretty much the focus of the Wasp Files, does have a lot of relevance in relation to this. The media are being very, very cautious about how they report this incident, and I'm seeing that fingers are being pointed in the wrong directions. It is high time that the media stood up as well and had some integrity in actually reporting the truthful elements of this crime. Yes, of course, there is still an investigation to be carried out, and I'm sure that's underway, whether or not these people were associated with a whole group of radicalised Islamic factions or other entities, foreign entities, that may have been perpetrating or planning this event is yet to be determined But it should be of concern to most Australians that there seems to be an ignorance or an aversion to tackle the real issue, and yet we have this very sort of stalwart, knee-jerk reaction of course, introducing severe bans on firearms and strengthening anti-hate laws against far-right extremists who, despite their very vocal and at times, physical altercations in relation to those protests, are not the people going out there with licensed or unlicensed firearms and opening fire on the Jewish population. In relation to that, the New South Wales Premier has rammed through very severe restrictions on firearm ownership in New South Wales. This was done prior to Christmas with zero consultation with any of the heads of the sporting shooters bodies that exist in Australia, which is CIFA, NIOA, Shooters Union, Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, which are usually consulted prior to the implementation of legislation. This did not happen, and there is outrage. There is also a lot of resistance, not only politically, from many members of Parliament and political parties such as the Nationals and One Nation. Interestingly enough, during the so-called marathon 17-hour session debating the implementation of this rushed legislation, which took something like 17 hours, the Greens had abstained from voting, which is somewhat unusual given that the Greens are generally known to be anti-gun. However, with the bipartisanship decisions of the Labor and Liberal Party, this legislation was passed, at least in New South Wales. Other states have balked. States like South Australia, Northern Territory, and even Victoria want a more considered and consultative approach prior to implementing any changes and reforms to gun ownership in Australia. This has caused an extreme backlash, not only amongst the general public, but in all avenues of Australian society, including the government, as to the ineptitude and the weakness and inactivity of the Albanese government and the New South Wales government, and also elements of the authorities in preemptively dealing with the problems that were rising in relation to anti-Semitism and keeping Australians safe on the streets. So there is some very, very vocal and very vitriolic responses to Anthony Albanese's decisions and responses to the Bondi terror attacks. Once again, with the Port Arthur Massacre, John Howard was able to get all of the states in line to bring in the strict firearm reforms that he brought in when he was banning high-powered semi-automatic rifles and pump-action shotguns and the like. At one point, John Howard confronted a very, very angry crowd of shooters where he was wearing clearly a bulletproof vest beneath his suit and basically trying to placate the shooters about his decisions in removing those firearms from society post-Port Arthur. I guess in that case, it seemed to be a little bit more acceptable to the politicians at the time and the general public that these type of firearms were not required to be in society. So John Howard was quite successful in implementing those changes. And then, of course, was lauded for saying that since Port Arthur in 1996, there have been no gun massacres in Australia, which is not exactly true. We have had 13 massacres, certainly not of the scale of Port Arthur, but a firearm massacre is generally classified to be more than 4 people, and we have had 13 incidents involving 4 or more people being killed with firearms. So we certainly haven't prevented entirely those kind of activities, and we've also seen a spate of recent drive-by shootings involving very high-powered illegal weapons. There was the Casula shooting, which I mentioned in the first episode.
A chilling scene has unfolded on a residential street in Casula. A gunman using a high-powered machine gun opening fire on a home in the middle of the night, all while his accomplice behind the wheel of the getaway car filmed the brazen late-night attack.
Opening fire on a Casula street. A high-powered machine gun blasting bullets, filmed by his accomplice. The gunman isn't done yet.
Quick.
At least 40 shots fired into a McKellar Street home around 2 a.m. The gunman, weapon in hand, eventually flees after a nervous calling from his colleague.
Quick, bro.
Police say they've never seen anything like it.
There was also another shooting in Bosley Park in Sydney where two individuals, and they were very of young age, one was 20, I believe, the other was 18, who'd opened fire on a premises with a semi-automatic AK-47, which was clearly seen when these two individuals were intercepted by police. So, are we safe? Have we ever been safe since 1996? Goes without saying, once again, criminals and terrorists do not follow the law. So, by restricting firearm ownership, law-abiding firearm owners who are up in arms, if you'll pardon the pun, in relation to these government endeavours, it's very clear that it's not going to make us safer and that we're still going to have more incidents. It should also be of serious concern that something like 100,000 immigrants from potentially troublesome Middle Eastern countries such as Syria and Afghanistan have been permitted access to Australia, and if proper vetting has not been done with some of these individuals, or there is not enough surveillance on the type of organisations and imams that through learning centres are radicalising young men in this country, that we have a very strong likelihood that there will be more homegrown domestic terrorist attacks carried out by radicalised Islamic factions. It's not enough to just say we can't mention this. It has to be addressed directly and fully. The government has let in potential terrorists into our country. That is very clear. They've also done very little to stem the actions of violent criminals that are using illegal and in some cases very high-powered semi-automatic firearms to conduct criminal activity and to open fire on their rivals. This is the issue. Once again, another parallel with the Port Arthur Massacre was that prior to that event, the New South Wales Premier at the time, Barry Unsworth, was famous for quoting, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until there's a massacre in Tasmania," which preemptively reported that there possibly would be something like the Port Arthur Massacre, which then occurred some months later. 2 days before the Bondi attacks, the former Prime Minister John Howard, who was responsible for implementing the gun restrictions after Port Arthur, had come out saying that there needed to be further restrictions placed on firearms in Australia in relation to the Wyambillia shooting that took place up in Queensland. So we do have these parallels, these, if you want to call them that, patterns that seem to be arising, whereby there is some indication that the requirements for further gun restriction need to be considered. And then, lo and behold, we have an event which seems to reinforce that belief. In a previous episode of the Wasp Files, I discussed the United Nations Agenda 2030, which is a public document that was drafted and presented by the United Nations, which is a blueprint for, in essence, a new world, a new balanced, utopian and peaceful world, and that part of that agenda, very clearly and publicly available, is total civilian disarmament of small arms, ostensibly by 2030, which is 4 years from now. So the question has to be asked, how would they be able to implement this wonderful new agenda if there are something like 1 billion firearms in the world? This was discussed in the previous episode. So this kind of foreknowledge of the need by certain aspects of the people who govern us to restrict firearms to the civilian population comes out and is reported and made available prior to an event occurring, and then an immediate response to then implement exactly those requirements and start taking firearms out of the civilian population. It's something that needs to be discussed, but it does raise certain suspicions about the agendas of the powers that be to have some say in what occurs to remove firearms from society and perhaps their foreknowledge of events. I would like to finish up this episode by discussing some of the comments that are surfacing on the Wasp Files that are criticising what they consider to be an aversion for myself to place the blame squarely on Mossad or elements of Zionism or the Jewish community that may or may not have been behind the Bondi attacks themselves. And there has been mention that there was some internet searching that was done prior to Bondi where the names of the perpetrators and Bondi itself had surfaced on internet searches from Israel. I have to state that the Wasp Files was created primarily to focus on the Port Arthur Massacre and to do so by discussing in a balanced kind of open way and ask questions about all of the aspects of that tragedy. This, by its nature, would also include the actions or inactions of the governments, the authorities, the police and the intelligence agencies, and also the criminal aspect of the use of firearms and so on. Other than that, my own investigations with the Port Arthur Massacre have not provided enough concrete evidence for me to draw Mossad into the equation as being responsible for the Port Arthur Massacre. It's not enough for someone to say the Port Arthur Massacre was Mossad. There was referencing to Joe Vile's book, Deadly Deception at Port Arthur, which I've stated was not on my preferred reading list in relation to Port Arthur because Joe Viles took far too many leaps of conjecture. So he would report, for instance, the unmarked black van that was witnessed parked in front of the Broad Arrow Cafe after the shooting and say, therefore it's Mossad. It's not strong enough to be able to make that accusation. So until I see stronger evidence that Mossad may have been involved in the Port Arthur Massacre or in the Bondi attacks, it's too early to point those fingers and to certainly accuse the Wasp Files of being pro-Israel or negating the fact that that intelligence organisation may have been behind the attack. Of course, Mossad is known to be one of the most ruthless and efficient intelligence agencies in the world, and very much like the CIA, intelligence agencies often operate in very shadowy areas outside of the law and conduct some very nefarious activities. It's also publicly known that the attack on Gaza has been considered by many to be an international crime against humanity, the crime of genocide, and so there is nations that have supported the arrest of Netanyahu. But the Wasp Files is not here to take a political stance on the conflict between Israel and the Middle Eastern nations that are in opposition to the Jewish people. We are here primarily to focus on the Port Arthur Massacre. The Bondi attacks, just by the nature of that attack, have some uncomfortable parallels with Port Arthur. But it is too early to make a lot of determinations. We can only hope that there is a detailed coronial inquest or royal commission and that the perpetrator who has survived, the son, is then permitted to be able to be trialled in court to basically provide some kind of affirmation as to why the attack was carried out. I have my doubts. Once again, as with Port Arthur, I'm starting to see very uncomfortable indications that there is going to be, in essence, a form of cover-up and that we will never get the full story. Part of the reason for why Anthony Albanese may have refused a royal commission is that that would then shine a light on the actions or inactions of ASIO itself and or some of the higher level management of the police in relation to dealing with radicalised Islamic factions on our soil and certainly in New South Wales. So once again, we have to wait for the truth or search for the truth, and the Wasp Files is here to ask the questions. That's all we're here to do. It's up to everyone to make their own determinations, but I do stress that it's very important not to jump to conclusions, not to believe everything you see or read, particularly with AI that's coming out and, obviously creating false situations and misinformation that is then perpetrated through social media. Digging for the truth is not easy, but the best we can do is try and keep a level head, keep vigilant, hold our authorities to account, and keep asking the questions, and that's what I'll continue to do. I just want to finish up by saying I hope everyone had a great Christmas, and I hope you have a safe New Year's as well, and I'll see you in 2026 for more Wasp Files. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. New episodes will be uploaded every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Feel free to share far and wide, and please see the links to the Dropbox files and information relating to the episodes. Also, without any obligation, please see the Buy Me a Coffee campaign, which helps keep the channel running and also provides profits to my friends who are survivors from Port Arthur who have supported me on this journey. Thank you.